You know, most of us know the story of the American Revolution, that incredible fight for independence against a global empire. But have you ever stopped to think about what happened the day after they won? See, winning a war is one thing, but building an entire nation from scratch, that's a whole different ballgame. Today we're going to dive into those chaotic, uncertain, and honestly fascinating years right after the Revolution, a time when the brand new United States was teetering on the edge of collapse.
And that was it. That was the single biggest question on everyone's mind. The victory parades were over, the confetti was swept up, and now the real work had to begin. They had this idea of a country on paper, but in reality, they had no strong government, no stable economy, and honestly, no real sense of being one people. The question wasn't about how to win freedom anymore, it was what in the world do you do with it?
Okay, so let's get our timeline straight. In 1776, you have the Declaration of Independence. Boom, the war starts. 7 long years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ends it. Great Britain finally says, all right, you're your own country. That whole period was about winning the fight. But the period after 1783, that was about something way harder, surviving the peace.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down today. We'll start with the huge challenges they faced right out of the gate. Then, we'll look at why the states weren't really united. We'll examine their first shot at a government, see how that led to a massive crisis, and finally, understand why they had to scrap the whole thing and start over. So picture this. The ink on the Treaty of Paris is barely dry. The United States is officially born. But this was no fairy tale ending, not by a long shot. It was actually the beginning of a whole new set of massive problems. I mean, getting recognized as an independent nation was a huge deal. An absolutely monumental achievement. But what did that actually mean on the ground? Well, it meant the new country was suddenly all on its own, facing a world of trouble without the structure, or frankly, the protection of the British Empire.
And the challenges were just immense. The war left the nation with a crushing, almost unimaginable debt. There was no strong central government to make decisions, the economy was an absolute mess, and nobody was really sure how this whole experiment in self-government was even supposed to work. It was freedom, all right, but it was a chaotic and deeply uncertain kind of freedom. A big part of that chaos came from a really fundamental problem. The United States, well, they weren't all that united. In reality, it was a lot more like 13 small, bickering countries that were loosely, and I mean loosely, tied together.
You have to remember, people back then didn't really think of themselves as Americans first. Not at all. They were Virginians or New Yorkers or Georgians. Sure, the 13 states banded together to fight a common enemy, but as soon as that enemy was gone, all their old differences and rivalries came roaring right back. And this just paints a perfect picture of the chaos. I mean, can you imagine trying to run a country where every state has its own laws, its own money, and its own rules for trade? Just doing business between North Carolina and South Carolina could be as complicated as trading with a foreign country. It was a complete recipe for confusion and conflict.
So why was it like this? Well, it all comes down to one powerful emotion: fear. The states had just fought a brutal war to escape what they saw as the tyranny of a powerful, faraway government in London. So the absolute last thing they wanted was to create another powerful government right in their own backyard. This fear of a strong central authority was the single biggest obstacle to becoming a unified nation. And that fear? It was baked directly into the nation's first constitution. It created a system that was, by its very design, meant to be weak and deeply, deeply flawed.
This first system was called the Articles of Confederation, and its main purpose was simple: keep pretty much all the power with the states and make sure the national government was as weak as humanly possible. There was no president, no national court system, just a Congress with extremely limited authority.
And this table here, it just lays out the problem perfectly. Look at the powers the central government didn't have. It couldn't collect taxes to pay its debts, it couldn't control trade between the states, it couldn't even enforce its own laws. It could declare war, sure, but then it had to go hat in hand and ask the states for soldiers and money. It was a government with a ton of responsibility, but almost zero actual power. So yeah, when you boil it all down, the Articles of Confederation created a system that was basically toothless. It was a government that couldn't govern, and the consequences of this weakness would soon be felt across every single one of the 13 states. This flawed system didn't just cause theoretical problems on paper, it created a real-world crisis that threatened to completely destroy the young nation before it ever got off the ground. First, there was the money. The country was flat broke, drowning in debt from the war. And this was debt owed to foreign nations.
and even to its own soldiers. But remember, under the Articles, the national government couldn't tax anyone. It could only ask the states for money. And more often than not, the states just ignored the requests. So that debt just kept growing.
And the economic chaos just spiraled. Britain, now a rival, cut the US off from its profitable trade networks. The national currency was pretty much worthless. Trade between states was a nightmare with 13 different currencies floating around. And to make it all worse, the national military was so small it couldn't even defend its own borders. The nation was an economic and a military sitting duck. This all came to a head with an event called Shays' Rebellion. What happened was, in Massachusetts, farmers, many of them veterans of the war, were losing their farms because of debt and high taxes. When their protests were ignored, they picked up guns and rebelled against their own state government. The states struggled to stop it, and the national government? It was completely powerless to help. This was the big wake-up call, the moment many leaders realized their country was failing.
Shays' Rebellion was that final alarm bell. It exposed the fatal weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation for everyone to see and proved that the nation had finally reached its breaking point.
You know, the feeling among leaders like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton was just dread. The great experiment in liberty looked like it was about to end in total failure and chaos. The very system they had created to protect their freedom was now threatening to destroy it completely.
The reality under the Articles was just chaos and weakness. To survive, the country desperately needed stability and unity. It became painfully clear that getting there would require a completely different kind of government, one with the actual power to solve the nation's problems.
And this idea, it really captures the hard lesson learned during this whole period. That heroic struggle for independence was, in a lot of ways, the easy part. The truly difficult, grinding work was figuring out how to create a lasting, stable nation out of 13 divided states.
And so, the total failure of the Articles of Confederation led directly to one of the most important moments in American history. Leaders from the states decided to meet up, but not just to tweak the old system. Oh no. They decided to throw it out entirely and start over with a radical solution: writing a brand new constitution.
This whole crisis forced the nation's founders to face a fundamental question. They had designed a government to be weak because they were scared of power. Now they had seen the result: total chaos. So if that system was a complete failure, what would a better one even look like? How could they possibly create a government that was strong enough to unite a nation, but not so strong that it would threaten the very liberties they had just fought and died for? That's the question that would lead directly to the US Constitution.